Welcome, everyone. We're going to start off this panel, which is somewhat titled Mutual Understanding, Making Art Across Cultures, Cultural Divide, in just a moment, but we're going to launch first with a little bit of a film of some of the performance. So for those of you who haven't seen it, a little taste. Yeah, right, and that's it. Yeah. Yet reduced again to a formatted version of the entire story right there. So today's discussion is with dancers of the Mark Morris Dance Group and musicians from the Silk Road Ensemble. And before we do anything else, I just would love to start, Johnny, with you and just have everybody introduce.
Hello, I'm Johnny Gandelsman. I play violin in the Silk Road Ensemble, and along with Colin Jacobson, I guess I'm responsible for some of the arranging of this work.
Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Yard, a member of the Mark Morris Dance Group for about 20 years, and really excited to be here and doing this work.
Hi, I'm Aaron Liu, and I've been a dancer with Mark Morris Dance Group for 6 years.
Hello, I'm Colin Jacobson, also a violinist and composer-arranger with Silk Road. And like Johnny and Wuman, we've been with Silk Road basically since its beginning, which was the summer of 2000. And let's see, shortly afterwards, actually, that was the first time that Silk Road and Mark Morris did something together for Cal performances that I actually didn't play in, but I got to watch from the audience at that point.
Hi, I'm a woman. I play the pipa and also a member of Silk Road Ensemble, but I've been here quite a couple times here.
So this conversation today, I think, is an extremely important one, and I also think has the potential to be a lot of fun and also at times a little hard. So just to start with something difficult, I'm going to say something to you that is somewhat provocative and somewhat grim, followed by something which is really uplifting. So I just want to warn you, stick it out to the end.
Is it called a trigger warning?
It's a trigger warning. Exactly right. So lest we have any confusion about how important the arts are, let's look at it this way. And if you want to destroy a culture, and we, of course, in the US know about that because we've done it. We've done it at least twice, probably more than that. And frankly, we're not the first to do it. We didn't invent it, we learned it from others, but we've done it. How do we do it? The first thing you do is you take away the language. The second thing you do is you take away the family. And the third thing you do is you take away the music and the dance. Likewise, if you want to proliferate a culture, if you want to explode it for all that it's capable of transmitting, what do? You celebrate the language. You do so in community, in embracing of family, and you do it by dancing and singing together. There's nothing more important to the transmission of a culture than its ability to bind us together in music and in dance. So when we talk about this idea, thank you. When you talk about this idea of multiculturalism and collaboration across difference and that sort of thing, it's not a light topic. And it's not a topic about sitting together in a room and, watching each other slowly figure something out and finding things that are in agreement. It's actually living in the very gritty difficulty of truly inhabiting identity, not leaving it, and yet finding these pathways and these doorways that really do propose a greater humanity. To me, that's the genius of the Silk Road Ensemble. Has been from its inception, and in almost everything it's done. It's why I think it's making an invaluable contribution to the world. And it's also, I think, the genius of Mark Morris as a maker, that when you look at how he deems collaboration, which he often works in, how he inhabits that space, it is very nuanced and very unique, and I think unique to him as a maker. So these two dancers on either side of me have spent years with him and also have spent years in a process of how he goes about that. So we will talk about the wholeness of this experience, not just about tonight's performance. There'll be more of that in the next panel, so fear not. But let's frame this discussion this way, that we're talking about the true difficulty of this work and where the grit is, where the necessity of it is. Johnny, I'm going to start with you, if you would. Can you talk a little bit about just your own experience as a classical violinist? And you inhabit the space very much as a Western musician. and coming into a world where you're working profoundly in other vernaculars, and what those sort of first intimations were for you about finding your way into that, and how that sort of settled in the making of you as an artist.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, as Colin mentioned, been a member of the Silk Road Ensemble since around 2002. And up until that point, I was very much, a student of the classical music tradition. I was born in Russia. My family is a family of musicians. I started playing when I was 5 years old. And I came here when I was 17, and everything was kind of a very focused, narrow path to, I don't know what, world domination. No, but like just, it was very focused. And then somewhere along, around 96 or 97, it kind of took a big detour from the laid out path. And then I started focusing on chamber music and playing with other people and playing in orchestra, and the world of music started expanding. And then when I had a chance to sub for Colin at the Folklife Festival with the Silk Road Ensemble, then it really just exploded, because there were musicians from China and from Azerbaijan and from India, and it was all fascinating and slightly terrifying, because what was asked of us was to participate in all of these cultures, and without having any prior knowledge or experience, it was a little bit scary. I remember being on a train to DC and just thinking, I'm not qualified to be there. But what's really amazing about the Silk Road Ensemble, and I think that's probably something that's been there from the very beginning, is that the way that it's been set up, the way that Yo-Yo has envisioned it, it's a safe space for people to be who they are and to share their knowledge and their cultures. And we have been very lucky to have very kind and gentle guides into different cultures. And so, it's been
Can you talk a little bit about one relationship in particular that has really opened up for you a way of hearing differently, a way of dealing with the manner of your playing differently, or one mentorship you've had within the group?
Sure. When the very first time I played with the group in DC, there was a fabulous Indian tabla player named Sandeep Das. And I remember we were learning, he brought a piece that he wanted to do with the ensemble, and I remember learning it or trying to understand what he was talking about, and it was based on cycles and rhythms and numbers, and I was furiously trying to count and figure out what is he talking about. And at a certain point, it started kind of clicking, and I would say that now it's hard for me to play a Western piece of classical music without thinking of cycles and numbers, and so that's just one small example, and there are many more.
Great, thank you. Michelle, can you talk a little bit about maybe not this particular collaboration, but one of the most substantial collaborations you've had in the context of working with Mark, where this question came up of really having to cross a powerful divide between where the company is located in its own sort of understanding of itself as a American, if not Western, contemporary dance company, and wandering into just completely uncharted territory.
Sure. 2 years ago, the company had the great opportunity to participate in the Dance Motion USA tour. And we went to Cambodia, Taiwan, China, Timor-Leste. Is that it? That's it. But we spent 5 weeks on the road, and our first stop was Cambodia. And it was just an eye-opening experience to be in a place that was in a lot, like abject poverty, mostly. And also trying to rebuild after their experience with the Khmer Rouge and that awful situation. And us being there and trying to stay true to what we do and Mark's vision of modern dance, and that everybody can do it, that it's inclusive, not exclusive, and trying to communicate with the people there what we do and give them an experience that was meaningful and fulfilling. And at times it was very challenging because there was a language barrier. There were many things that were sort of put in the way just because we couldn't tell what was going to happen all the time. There were many, many obstacles along the way, but the thing that brought us all together was the dancing. And as a company, we learned the way they dance, and it was amazing and eye-opening. We had a few classes, and of course they took a lot of classes with us. That was the main reason we were there, was to teach them, you know, sort of Mark's style. And we got to perform for them, and we watched them perform. So it was just culturally just eye-opening to experience their culture, but like, as you said, through dance, and see people and see their families and see everybody struggling, but there was this commonality of music and dance. And we brought that and we got that from them. That happened throughout the whole trip. I mean, there were just instance after instance, going to orphanage or a home for abused women. It was just an amazing, amazing experience. And then that brings us to Layla and Majdan. I was really excited to do this project because Mark has not really done anything like this before. So for me, it was just a thrill because I've been in many, many, many projects with him, starting at the beginning, and then it all comes to fruition, opening night, here we go. And this was just something that was really special, and I think we could all tell right from the very beginning. And I mean, sorry, one more thing.
No, go ahead.
Mark has spent a lot of time in India. He goes almost every year, if not every year. So he has a great appreciation for many different cultures, many different styles of dance, and he definitely instills that in us. There are many times where he has, like, we do folk dancing classes, and you know, many of his operas, many of his dances have folk dances from all parts of the world. So we get it all the time. It's just sort of instilled in us, rhythmically, musically. That's all so very important to him.
I want to ask you the follow-up question, but I'm going to ask your colleague instead. Okay. So, following on that, to me, watching this piece, there were elements of in the movement that were really, in some ways, kind of un-Mark Morris-ish in some regards. There were elements of it that are so classically Mark. It's like you can't imagine anyone else could have made it. And then there were elements where I really felt he was, visually drawing so deeply from this culture and from the imagery that surrounds it. And I know part of his way in was through the artwork. It was through the visual art, in part because of his shared love with his collaborator, Howard Hodgkin, who also loves this Mugam art and collects it. But how did you feel in your process of entering the work as to what the influences were on the movement and how that became sort of acculturated into the piece?
Mark definitely did his research as far as trying to absorb a sense of what movement vocabulary from this part of the world would look like. And particularly, I think, in some of the refinements. In the last week before we put on the show, he was paying more and more attention to hands. Every rehearsal was hands, hands. Like, there was a very specific way that he wanted us to use them and to use them all the time, which felt to me like trying to give the work a real sense of place. And he also was researching Azerbaijani sort of classical dance, and when he visited Baku, they went to the national school there, and also looking up on YouTube and looking at wedding dances and how people dance in a social way and trying to incorporate that. I think whenever he's making a dance, his training is ballet and modern dance and flamenco and Eastern European folk dance. That's what's already in his body, and then I think his imagination for what he might want to see moves beyond that. And so in some dance, he might say, no, I want this to look like an Odissi, classical Indian move or shape. I want this to look, and for this, he had some ideas really of this movement I want to bring in. And I think that sort of comes to that gritty area of when you're working sort of outside, or you're making a dance that's addressing a culture that you didn't grow up in which you are a visitor or an observer. And so how do you create a piece that then is, true to you and to the piece itself? That's the challenge. And so I think his way of addressing it was wanting to bring in specific movement vocabulary that he found and seemed to fit to the piece. And then I think he also used, things came from his own body or came from his imagination. There are these great sort of folk dance numbers in the show that I think just seem so natural for him. But I think the refinements and the specificity became more and more important to give the piece that sense of place.
Place is a very interesting question when you talk about a dancer, particularly because the body is also a place, and that place is inhabiting a place, which is inhabiting a space, and we can go on Dr. Seuss. But Cat in the Hat. But the reality of it is exactly what you're saying, that there's a different question about potentially appropriation, or a question about that line when you're talking about a physical body that doesn't necessarily exist in quite the same way when you're talking about an instrument or something that is disembodied. And I wonder, for you, and also, Michelle, if you want to weigh in on this, how some of that has gone down for you in your dancing life. Particularly, you can speak to this piece if you want, or if there's another example you'd like to talk to.
The question of sort of when does what you're doing ever feel like appropriation in some kind of way?
Or how do you deal with it?
How do you deal with it? I think typically in Mark's work, he's so specific about what he wants. As a dancer, I have the luxury of sometimes not thinking outside of specifically sort of going for exactly what he's sort of trying to get us to go for. I think that question came up somewhat in our dance motion experience when we did this tour, and my perspective on it was the more time we spent with people, the richer the experience was. Right. And because of the nature of the program, they're trying to reach as many people as possible. So we did a lot of days where you have 40 minutes with a group, and there's still potential for exchange, but the most meaningful ones came from repeat experiences together, getting to share, getting to really have a back and forth. That just seems to be when you can sort of step beyond the superficial.
It's about respect.
Yeah.
I think by doing that, like spending time with a group like we did, Amrita, another dance company there. They're amazing. And we took class with them, we hung out with them, we got food, we spent time on a boat. So in that respect, when we're learning moves from them and trying to do it, we are told it's coming out of a place of respect and curiosity. And I think for them as well. And I think ultimately Mark tries to do that all the time because he's so very specific, like Aaron said, that he wants to get it right. He knows that that is special to somebody, their culture, and that is very important to him because his culture, our culture, is very important to him. And he wants that shown in a good light, the right light. So I think we try to do that as a company. And so we may not know all the specifics of the hand gestures, but we are totally willing to give it a try, and we're doing it from a place of understanding and ultimately respect.
There's a moment where I think any creator gets to assert that the aesthetic is going to drive the day, regardless. And I think that's for me where that line is. You know, if there's a question about appropriation, which is a very complicated topic, and I don't think really this is a landscape for that. I think, you know, certainly just the presence of the Qasimovs alone should dispel any concern there. But the beautiful response that you'll see in this work around that issue is truly remarkable.
And just to ask you guys a quick question, like, I mean, you wouldn't say though that what Mark is after is I don't know what the word would be, but like the equivalent of an ethnomusicologist. Like he's not trying to he's trying to create, not recreate dances, but yet be respectful of the background of the thing. Right.
He's trying to make a good show.
Right.
I think when it comes down to it, you want to make something that
And he does.
you watch and are interested, and you can sit and watch and listen and respond.
Right.
And I think that's always what it comes down to.
And that's exactly what happens. It's remarkable in that regard. Colin, let's move on to you. I wonder if you would talk a little bit, since you were kind of heading into that territory anyway, if you can talk a little bit about your own relationship with this sort of, let's talk about the context of classical and the context of traditional, which are two really complex and related words. Mm-hmm. So if we think about classical and how we think about it as Western musicians, and we think about traditional, which is a word in English we'll kind of use to talk about something that's also classical but not Western, you know, where in your experience and your work in the context of Silk Road has some of that terrain come up for you?
Well, I guess, you know, like Johnny growing up in a very specifically Western classical household, I likewise experienced at some point along the way, partly through the Silk Road Ensemble, partly right before due to a girlfriend who, you know, was opened my eyes to a lot of things. I think I experienced an ear-opening time. But I think the idea of classical, for instance, before having that experience of working with Alim or with Kehan Kalhor in the Silk Road Ensemble or Wuman, I think I thought of non-Western music as folk music. And then, of course, and that was like a very, very wrong-headed view of the world, but I just hadn't had that eye-opening experience. So I think what I learned, for instance, from Kehan is like there is the classical music of Iran, Persian classical music, and then there are hundreds and hundreds of folk musics and folk instruments. He has a book of folk instruments of Iran that's like this thick, you know, and every village has its own dialect, and that's the amazing connection of the language to the music, and that is very prevalent in the way we just heard, you know, the Golden Thread do their, a spoken word recitation, and actually, you know, in the deep part of Mugam, I would say, and you'll hear from Aida, or Daska system, at the heart of it is this deep connection of word to singing, you know, and spoken word to singing. And then the instrumental is so tied to that as well. And you hear it when the amazing instrumentalists improvise or comment on the themes that the singers are expounding upon. And of course, in the West, that is true too. I mean, we've spent our whole lives trying to be able to play the violin like a Western singer of Schubert Lied or whatever you want to do it. So, but I think a lot of how we learn is by imitating. And so to watch both Kehan, who's also a Comanche player, with a different style than Rauf Islamov, who's playing here. We've had the fortune, like you said, of spending a lot of time with them. So, just going to this piece, it's so amazing to me how many. When you get, Yo-Yo often talks about music as being the tip of the iceberg. I think that's true for every piece. The culture that surrounds it, that creates it, the individual creators that go into it. But this particular piece, I think that iceberg underneath this tip is so huge and vast, because and we could get into a little bit of that, just the fact that it's got the roots as a 1908 opera that this young 23-year-old created in order to bring opera to the masses of Azerbaijan and to bring together what he was hearing in terms of Western opera with Mugam, but
so that's
already
a really
right
important
there
point. So
is that
let's frame that. Just because I think you're saying something that everybody needs to know before you continue with that thought, which is, and I can do it or you can do it, but just the actual creation that is the original opera that's the foundation of this work. Is a really unusual work in the sense that it did begin as essentially a Western classical score in opera that was intended for an Azerbaijan audience. And what happened was that instead, in the recitative segments of this work, where you would have had the plot moving along through rapid speech, instead of doing what you would normally hear in Mozart or in Verdi, what you actually end up with is this composer inserted these segments of traditional. It was all traditional Mugam singing, right?
Yeah, and basically he just specified the text, the Fuzuli text, and the particular mode to be used.
Right.
But even the written down Western style numbers, Aida tells us, many of them are folk songs, so those have whatever tradition going back, So then you fast forward 100 years to us being able to tour with Alim and Fergana and Rauf and for years. And then while we were in Baku, Alim says to Yo-Yo, I would love to bring this to the world, this story and this opera that we do every year at the beginning of the year at the Baku Opera and at the National Opera. And then our task was, how do we make this work for our ensemble, which already is a mix of Chinese tradition, Western tradition, and Azerbaijani and Ko playing shakuhachi from Japan. And so I think what this all comes down to in a certain way is love. The question is, when you encounter something, you either can be repelled by it or you can be attracted to it, and how you deal with that. And that's where the question of appropriation begins, because it's like a relationship. You fall in love with something. Is it your desire to possess it, or is it your desire to honor it from afar, or all of those things that are embodied in the very story of Layla Majnun, I think, come into the work that has gone into this piece. And ultimately, I think... well, I don't know. I'm lost. I'll pass this.
No, you're not lost. It's just a winding road of a conversation. You are not lost.
Oh, this is what the last thing I wanted to say is just, when we first started working on this, I think that the part that repelled us, forgive me if I'm speaking for you, not repelled, but was a question mark for us, was actually the Western style sections, because they seemed to us more reminiscent of 19th century exoticism in the form of Rimsky-Korsakov or whatever. And I feel like we've been trying to run away from that, actually, in the Silk Road Ensemble, and not have something feel exoticized. Turns out Mark actually loves those sections. And, and actually, in a way, through Mark, and also, those are, there's a question mark of, what is airport gift shop? Mark often uses that term, and what is authentic? And, as a Westerner, you think that when you go to a country, Cambodia, that the authentic could not be found in the airport gift shop. Well, it turns out that in the airport gift shop, there are these gorgeous scarves that are made by people at this silk farm that you guys visited, right? So, I'm going off here, and basically the Western style sections are actually as much a part of Azerbaijan's heritage as the mugam. And that's what we learned is like Alim loves singing those sections. And so we fell in love with them through Alim and newly through Mark's love of actually the way that we were talking in the previous group about this isn't, I think Mark does not like the holier than thou Western approach to Eastern cultures, you know? So I think that's what's beautiful is like this piece has the spirituality, it has kitsch in it actually too, and it all comes together for a lot of fun and a lot of beauty ultimately because it's not put in a very narrow place.
Well, hilariously, this piece, well done. Yeah. Yeah. Hilariously, this piece, as you pointed out from its inception, contains so many conundrums and so many things you run up against. I remember talking with Matthias Tarnopolsky, our executive director, and having a conversation with him about Brahms' Hungarian Rhapsody and wondering where that fits in the same conversation, which is, there you go. I mean, it's exactly to the point, but it's very well stated. Thank you. Wuman, Europe. You kind of are the person here who's come from the other direction. So talk to us a little bit, if you can, about your process of coming from China to here and your training and how it led you into this conversation.
Well, this is a kind of long story. As Colin mentioned, yeah, you're right. I'm totally opposite. I'm from the other side, and that tradition. And to me, this piece is very Western. Basically, I play guitar part.
Really well, I might add.
Actually, last night we're behind the waiting for get on the stage, and we're listening to the first set, which they play mugam, and somehow they come up with the ending. They come up with a folk tune, and I said to me and Johnny and Colin, I said this very Russian song. And Colin said, "Well, yeah, you know, you somehow you mentioned that you're training classical background." I said, "No, I'm not. I'm traditional." And you mentioned that no, you're Chinese classical. I said, "Yeah, that's right." So that's come back to what you said. What do you mean classical? What do you mean folk or tradition? Yeah, I was born in China. I grew up in China. I play this Chinese instrument. Grew up with that. Basically, play all the Chinese traditional music. But again, I trained in conservatory in Beijing, so I do read Western notation. I do know a little bit of Western classical music. So, what was your question? I'm sorry.
Just your process of coming into this whole conversation with Silk Road, or really just first to the U.S. and then into Silk Road. I mean, there's some pretty interesting ways in which you have situated yourself as a musician here that are remarkably different than the traditional track you might have gone.
Yeah, to me, again, I come from the other way. When I landed in this country, and I asked myself, nobody knows what the instrument I'm holding. Anybody knows? Yeah. But you know, in 1990s, nobody knows. That's kind of a strange instrument. Wow, from China, what is that? Is that guitar? I said no. It's kind of a guitar. What is that? I said pipa. And what is a pipa? It's a pipe. So, so my question was, how can I come into this society to introduce this instrument, to introduce this culture, which is very cool instrument. The pipa, I think it's a very cool instrument, but very difficult. How can I introduce to everybody here? How can I involve the music scene here? So that's how I started work together with the different musicians. So again, come to the Silk Road Ensemble. That's actually perfect fit my goal. Fit my mission, and it's so luckily, as Johnny mentioned, it's kind of a safe place for all of us to to have any crazy idea to come up and to do experimental as this project as well.
It's one of the things that's amazing about this whole process, both from the physical standpoint and from the musical standpoint, is finding yourself in the situation where you actually have to ask of your instrument, whether it's your body or the thing you're holding or playing, to do something it just doesn't do, you know, or it just is sort of, well, that's kind of not in this vernacular or this vocabulary. And that moment of sort of being disembodied from the thing that you're sort of most accustomed to, and then finding yourself in this object that is the creation, and how that takes on its own sort of separate meaning based on the accumulation of events. And it is just staggering watching this, just as a model for life, you know, what comes up for you. I mean, yes, the aesthetic of the work is magnificent, the creation is beautiful, you'll take it on all of these terms, but the things that it proposes about what we all have to do to find each other is quite remarkable. And that thread of viewing it, I think, is profoundly rewarding, and I'm looking forward to seeing it the next 2 times for that, going on that track, you know, as opposed to the just receiving of this absolutely stunningly gorgeous accomplishment. I want to ask you all one more question and then leave a little time for people to ask you questions. So we're going to come back to you, Johnny. Are you ready? It's the same question for everybody. It's the same question. It's really easy. No. Yeah, it's really easy. Can you talk about one truly transformational artistic relationship or creative relationship you've had with someone where you shared virtually nothing at the beginning of it? No, maybe not even language, maybe certainly not instrument, something that really took you to a completely different view, or was just a hard bridge to cross?
Michelle, what?
You're going to get the same question, so start thinking now.
Oh, wow, that's... Well, you know, the thing is that when you don't know something, it can be scary. So, and you know, even if you have things in common, the first, you know, you might not see it at first. So, you know, the
Welcome to voiceover.
Exactly.
It wasn't me.
That was great. Next.
Yeah. Just, or, you know, even focus on a particular relationship or moment. I mean, not even less general, just very...
Well, no, it's just, you know, you know, Colin mentioned Kayhan, and, you know, Kayhan Kalhor is, you know, one of the great musicians of our time who happens to play the kemanche. But you know, and so he that's Persian spike fiddle. Yo-Yo thinks of it as of the instrument as the grandfather of the cello. But if Yo-Yo didn't say that, I don't know if, you know, I would have made the connection necessarily. But then working with Kayhan, well, and I'm not even going to go into the fact that when I moved to the U.S., I moved from Israel, and so I was an Israeli citizen until a couple of years ago. Kayhan is from Iran. You know, here we are sitting together trying to figure out how to make music. You know, but then actually, you know, working with them, you end up finding. I would say that we always find more connections than differences. You know, there are differences, of course, but there are so many ways to relate, you know, and through the process of, you know, looking for those and finding them, it's where, you know, personally, my life has been incredibly enriched by those moments. They happen all the time. I'm very lucky.
Michelle?
Sure. You know, as I've said, I've worked with Mark for a very long time, so there have been many experiences over the years, but actually this production of Layla and Majnun has been great just because, like I said, Mark doesn't usually do things like this. And so you mentioned the Mugam. I don't know if we mentioned so much that they can improv those Mugams. And when we work music and when Mark choreographs something, it is pretty much to the music, down to the beat. Like, there's no, room for, improv on our part. Unless, he may say at some point, like, oh, you can do this thing instead of that thing. But it's never just like, you have free reign, do whatever you want. No, it is choreographed to the meter, yeah. So working on this project and having the music for a really long time, not all of it, getting parts of it, but knowing that the Mugams, they would be able to improvise. And it may take longer, it might be shorter, we'll never know that. And so that has been, we kind of don't. If they're really, really feeling it in the moment, it goes a little bit longer. And so for us, while when we perform all the time, we're very much attuned to the music, we're attuned to each other, we're very aware of what's going on, this is even more so. It's like everybody's ears. I said if we were like elfins in Lord of the Rings, all our little pointy ears would be like ding, because we are just looking at each other. It's like we use our cue, like we use each other as cues. We listen for words, like we don't really speak the language, but there are words that we've now heard over a year that we can kind of go, oh right, when she sings that, we're gonna do this. Like we're just waiting to hear that. Or there's just a subtle like change in the bass line that we know to go to a different step. And that's not how we work. There are lots of other cultures, African tribes, like you dance and you go and go and go till you hear that change, and then everybody knows that they do something different. That's not how we work. We generally know what is going to happen all the time. So for me, that has been really fun, and just keeping it really alive, because we're just not exactly sure what's going to happen. And that's very different from what Mark generally does. And it's not that we don't know what's gonna happen. I mean, we do. It's just a matter of when. So it's not all just a like, oh my God, it's not choose your own adventure. It's just, it might just be slightly different from what we're used to every single time we do it. And that's fun.
When is a big question in a time-based art form. Yeah. Moving on. For you, Aaron.
So every time Mark visits India, he visits his very good friends at the Nrityagram dance company, and his very
This is a really, really, really famous, incredibly important dance compound where dance happens like 24/7.
Odissi dance, classical Indian dance. Sharupa Sen is the choreographer there and a very close friend of his, and Vijayani Satpathy, who is the sort of star dancer in addition to Sharupa and a teacher. And on one of their visits, we had an hour and a half class from Vijayani. And this would be an example of when not that much time still somehow manages to go very deep. And it was, I don't know, it may have just been the same class that she would teach to a room of 11-year-olds. Like it was just, we were just learning. We went through all the mudras and she was teaching us a few sequences. And the way that she taught, her reverence for the movement and where it comes from. I mean, these are dances that are based on temple dances that are thousands of years old and are based on the shapes that you see in the carvings on temples. This has this incredible history, and her belief in us, her respect for us, and the way that then we just wanted as best we could to try to achieve this, to find all of these subtleties, this completely different way of moving, highly, like, intimidatingly specific. And that she just kept going, believing we could do it. That day was a transformative experience. I felt like I got a window into a whole different way of looking at dance, and also felt capable of more than I sort of had ever thought. And I also feel like Michelle, that this experience with Layla and Majnun is a similar thing, and has the potential, since we have so much more time with it, to really go deeper, because I think there's so much that we will continue to learn about Mugam by dancing to it, developing these exact skills, and also learning the text more and more. And the more that I can learn from Aida, and the more that I can learn from Alim and Fargana, and just being around them and being able to be a part of their art. I was thinking what Collins had said about the idea of sort of falling in love with something, and do you want to possess it, or do you want to sort of honor it from a distance? And it seems like the goal of what we're trying to make with Layla and Majnun, which is also, I think, in some ways, the lesson of the story is like, how do you just become one? Mm-hmm. How does the whole production just feel like we are one, we are all performers on this stage, and we're just one piece?
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on that element because I think in terms of transformative things, sometimes it is something very subtle that can open a door in your thinking. And I was thinking about how you were saying the hands more and more this week. And in a way, for us to feel like we were not interlopers or in the appropriation question, I think actually learning a few of the ornaments that the Azerbaijanis do and being able to apply them to, for instance, the wedding scene, it's like, I think Western classical music used to be more ornamented, and through greater and greater specificity and control on the part of composers, everything got more notated, so you weren't adding as much. That's the history that we have, in order that you got a symphony orchestra of 100 people or whatever, all doing individual things that are part of a whole. But in this improvised tradition and in just the philosophy, it seems, that goes with incredibly ornate carpets and poetry and calligraphy, ornamentation is king, and it really, without it, it loses that essential nature. So I think learning some of the ornaments just from playing with Rauf and Kayhan as well has really changed the way we feel about both the Mugam sections and the Western sections, actually, and made it feel more like one, this piece, which was a lot of our desire, was not that it felt like, here's the Eastern section, here's the Western, back and forth, but that it was one thing. And I'll just add also that if we're talking across cultures, I mean, Silk Road has its own culture that's been going since 2000. Mark Morris has its own culture. They're very different, and yet actually, I do feel like both Yo-Yo and Mark create idealized versions of community in very, very different ways. So I think for us coming into, what it is that Mark is specific on every part of every show that he's involved in. And he will get in there for every part of it, including as specific as the singers, how far the mic is away from them, or, something you're doing on the pipa, don't run with the pipa. I don't know. Because bad things will happen. I don't know. So I think it's actually quite interesting because Yo-Yo will sometimes go in very specifically, but more often he's about a very big picture in terms of rehearsal and really about creating this, what you call the safe place for people to do their thing on an individual basis and run with projects. Mark's version of idealized community is much more top-down, I would say. So that's just interesting for musicians who are used to having a very strong voice all the time in Silk Road, and a very chaotic process, I should say, in Silk Road. Like, rehearsals are chaos. With you guys, it's very orderly.
Again, it's that time-based art form striking again. Ruman.
I want to pick up what Colin said. My experience, basically for me, I think, Johnny's laughing at, it's eye-open. The whole thing, the whole process, because I never played it with a bigger dance company. I played it with the individual dancer or something. So, and again, Mukam tradition, which is I have to say I'm familiar with, because in China we also have Mukam. Western part of China, Uyghur, they have Mukam tradition as well. So I learned from them. So I fascinating to hear the difference. The Azerbaijan Mukam, the style, the singing style, also the ornamentation with the Uyghurs, very different. So that to me, that's very appreciated. I love being sitting there and listen to them to sing. Every night they sing differently. They improvise. They're just, wow, oh yeah, she does that again. Oh, she didn't. but for again, come back to Colin mentioned the whole environment of the whole process. I remember first day I walked in the rehearsal. I feel like, yeah, it's gonna be play same concert piece. So I'm pretty much ready and like kind of like want to be virtuoso, whatever call. And Mark just came. I think he was like, "Hey band, you can't do this. This is not concert." Yeah, and then like we were like suddenly very quiet. Okay, yeah, we realized this is, and then like so we learned. I learned those to me as Erin mentioned, this is the whole piece. This is not dance. This is not music. Not a concert, and not opera. This is a whole piece of art, and presented to audience. That's it. So I really learned. I appreciated that.
Beautifully said and entirely true. Okay, right. We just have a few minutes, and I'm sure there are questions out there. So I will take just a few questions, and then we'll take a short break. Right up here. Let me just, for those who might not have heard it, the question is about the opening musical act and the beautiful way in which that seemed to sort of encapsulate the whole work. And was that an overture? Was it part of the piece? What was the choice about having them there? Anyone have a...
Oh, well, so one of the first things that Mark said when when we started talking about this project as something that actually is going to happen is we're going to need understudies. I'm not doing the show without understudies. And to us, it was like, oh yeah, of course, we need understudies. So then we went to Baku and we listened to a few amazing singers. And the two young musicians that you're talking about were the ones that we chose, and we're so lucky to have them here. But I think, Mark made it's one of his like genius choices to actually start, so they're not just sitting around as understudies, checking Facebook. They're actually, they're participating in the show, and it sets up, as you said, like it sets up the mood for audience that may otherwise not know what to expect. It puts the audience in the space, and I should just also say that not just the audience, but what's amazing is what's happening backstage during their singing. You can't see it from the hall, but the dancers are warming up in the wings, and the musicians are listening to the music. But then there's a moment where they go into this amazingly infectious dance song, and then at that point everybody we look across the stage, the wings, and everyone's dancing, and like, all right, here we go, and it just actually sets everyone into this incredible feeling of like, it's hard to imagine a different way of doing it. If we would just go into, because the story starts, as Mark has been saying to us, they're not dead yet, but it's pretty, the way that the actual piece starts is pretty serious. So, but to have this joyous moment right before going on stage is so fun.
Great. Another question. Another one somewhere. Yeah.
So just to dovetail on what some of you have said, and particularly Erin talking about the oneness and the oneness of dancers and the music, and so I just always have to say it's also the oneness with the audience.
The statement was about the oneness not just being within the performing artists and the work itself, but also with the audience, that the entire thing becomes sort of a giant circuit.
He always tells us to let the audience in. We're not doing it, it's not an inner reflection. We're doing it because we have an audience. We want to share it with the audience. So he's always very, very specific about that. So I'm glad you felt that, because that's what he tells us all the time.
And I think it's very much like the value that he and Yo-Yo share. We get that all the time too. It's like this is about them we are the vessels for that. And so I think that's probably why this collaboration works, is because those values are very much at the core of what both of them do.
That is 4 o'clock, so we're going to stop right there. Please join me in thanking these wonderful artists.